The science and ethics of mattering. Matter and meaning are not separate elements. They are inextricably fused together, and no event, no matter how energetic, can tear them asunder. Even atoms, whose very name, atomos, means indivisible or uncuttable, can be broken apart. But matter and meaning cannot be dissociated, not by chemical processing or centrifuge or nuclear blast. Mattering is simultaneously a matter of substance and significance, most evidently perhaps when it is the nature of matter that is in question, when the smallest parts of matter are found to be capable of exploding deeply entrenched ideas and large cities. Perhaps this is why contemporary physics makes the inescapable entanglement of matters of being, knowing, and doing, of ontology, epistemology, and ethics, of fact and value so tangible, so poignant. Setting the scene. It's September 1941 when Nazi empire building had reached its pinnacle. The German physicist Werner Heisenberg paid a visit to his mentor Niels Bohr in Nazi-occupied Denmark. Bohr was of Jewish ancestry, was head of the world-renowned physics institute in Copenhagen that bears his name. Heisenberg, Bohr's protege and a leading physicist in his own right, was at that time head of the German effort to produce an atomic bomb. Filled with nationalist pride for his homeland, Heisenberg decided to stay in Germany despite offers from abroad. But by all accounts, he was not a Nazi or a Nazi sympathizer. Bohr and Heisenberg were two of the great leaders of the quantum revolution in physics. Their respective interpretation of quantum physics, complementarity and uncertainty, constitute the nucleus of the so-called Copenhagen interpretation of quantum physics. The two Nobel laureates had a special bond between them, a relationship described as that between father, Bohr, and son, Heisenberg, that was broken apart by the events of the inauspicious visit. Although the details of what transpired during their fateful exchange in the autumn of 1941 are still a matter of controversy, it is clear that matters of the gravest consequences, including the prospect of a Germanic atomic bomb, were discussed. Why did Heisenberg come to Copenhagen? What was he hoping to talk with Bohr about? What were his intentions? Did Heisenberg hope to find out what Bohr knew about the Allied bomb project? Did he come to warn Bohr about the German project and reassure him that he was doing everything in his power to stall it? Did he want to see if he could convince Bohr to take advantage of their shared status as authorities on atomic physics, to convince both sides to abandon their respective projects to build atomic weapons? Did he hope to gain some important insight from his mentor about physics, or ethics, or the relationship between the two? This question, why Heisenberg went to see Bohr in 1941, is the focal point of a recent Tony Award-winning play that considers the controversy surrounding this fateful meeting. The play doesn't resolve the controversy. On the contrary, the play itself has gotten caught up in its very orbit. In Michael Frayn's play Copenhagen, the ghost of Bohr, Heisenberg, and Bohr's wife Margrethe meet at the old Bohr residence to try to reconcile the events of the fateful autumn day. As if working out the details of a problem in atomic physics, Bohr, Heisenberg, and Margrethe make 3 attempts to calculate Heisenberg's intentions by enacting and at times stopping to reflect on 3 possible scenarios of what might have occurred. Each attempt to resolve the uncertainty is foiled. But that is precisely the point Frayn wishes to make. Drawing an analogy with Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, Freyne suggests that the question of why Heisenberg came to Copenhagen in 1941 does not remain unresolved for any practical reason, such as some insufficiency in the historical record that can be straightened out with newfound evidence or some clarifying insight, but rather is unresolvable in principle because uncertainty is an inherent feature of human thinking. And when all is said and done, no one, not even Heisenberg, understands why he came to Copenhagen. Freyne's uncertainty principle, the one that says that we can, in theory, never know everything about human thinking, is not an actual consequence of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, but an invention of the playwright created purely on the basis of analogy. Freyne is not applying the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, which concerns the limits of our knowledge of the behavior of physical objects, like atoms or electrons, to the problem of what it is possible to know about human behavior. He is simply drawing a parallel. Using this analogy, Freyne moves rapidly from the realm of epistemology, question about the nature of knowledge, to the domain of morality, questions about values. From the uncertainty of intentionality to the undecidability of moral issues. On the basis of his own uncertainty principle, he reasons, or perhaps moralizes, that because we can never really know why anyone does what he or she does, moral judgments lose their foundation. We'll never know whether Heisenberg was actively trying to build an atom bomb for Germany, or whether he purposely foiled these efforts to prevent Hitler from getting his hands on new weapons of mass destruction. We are placed face to face with a question of profound moral significance, where nothing less than the fate of humanity was at stake. And uncertainty foils our efforts to assign responsibility. Uncertainty saves Heisenberg's tormented soul from the judgment of history. The play thereby raises more specters than it puts to rest. Copenhagen is an engaging, clever, and beautifully written play. It has all the allure of a romance, with its bold display of explicit intimacy between science and politics, peppered with the right amount of controversy. It also has its share of critics. While many critics have taken issue with important historical inaccuracies that haunt the play, my focus is on Freyne's portrayal of quantum physics and its philosophical implications, a portrayal, I will argue, that is fraught with difficulties. Freyne's play serves as a useful counterpoint to what I hope to accomplish in this book. On the surface, the subject matter may appear similar. Questions of science, politics, ethics, and epistemology are among the key concerns taken up in this book. Indeed, quantum physics and its philosophical implications and differences in the approaches of Bohr and Heisenberg figure centrally here as well. But this is where the similarity ends. We diverge in purpose, approach, methodology, genre, style, audience, backgrounds, interests, values, levels of accountability to empirical facts, standards of rigor, forms of analysis, modes of argumentation, and conclusions. Crucially, we are also sharply diverging in our philosophical starting points and the depth of our respective engagements with the physics and the philosophical issues. In an important sense, Freyne's viewpoint is more familiar and fits more easily with common sense notion about the nature of knowing and being than the view I will present here. Freyne presents his audience with a set of binaries, the social and the natural, the macroscopic and the microscopic, the laws of men and the laws of nature, internal states of consciousness and external states of being, intentionality and history, ethics and epistemology, discourse and materiality. In his approach to relating the two, is to draw analogies across the gap. He also presupposes a metaphysics of individualism for both the micro and macro scales. Humans, like atoms, are assumed to be discrete individuals with inherent characteristics such as intelligence, temperament, and intentional state of mind. And at times, he freely mixes issues of being and knowing, ontology and epistemology, as if they were interchangeable isotopes in a chemical brew. What, if anything, does quantum physics tell us about the nature of scientific practice and its relationship to ethics? Before this question can be approached, two prior issues must be addressed. First of all, there is an important sense in which the question is not well defined. The interpretative issue in quantum physics, i.e., questions related to what the theory means and how to understand its relationship to the world, are far from settled. When questions about the philosophical implications of quantum physics arise, no definitive answers can be given in the absence of the specification of a particular interpretation. Moreover, public fascination with the subject has been met with a plethora of popular accounts that have sacrificed rigor for the sake of accessibility, entertainment, and, if one is honest, the chance to garner the authority of science to underwrite one's favorite view. As a result, the public is primed to accept any old counterintuitive claim as speaking the truth about quantum theory. These factors taken together pose serious difficulties for anyone trying to make sense of, let alone answer, this potentially important question. Clearly, any serious consideration of this question must begin by disambiguating legitimate issues from fancy and taking a clear stand with respect to the interpretative issues. Public fascination with quantum physics is probably due in large part to several different factors, including the counterintuitive challenges it poses to modernist worldview, the fame of the leading personalities who developed and contested the theory, Einstein not least among them, and the profound and world-changing application quantum physics has wrought, often symbolized in the public imagination, fairly or unfairly, by the development of the atomic bomb. But can it be this factor alone, this public hunger to know about quantum physics, that accounts for the plethora of incorrect, misleading, and otherwise inadequate accounts? What is it about the subject matter of quantum physics that it inspires all the right questions, brings the key issues to the fore, promotes open-mindedness and inquisitiveness, and yet when we gather round to learn its wisdom, the response that we get almost inevitably seems to miss the mark? One is almost tempted to hypothesize an uncertainty relation of sorts that represents a necessary trade-off between relevance and understanding. But this is precisely the kind of analogical thinking that has so often produced unsatisfactory understanding of the relevant issues. We cannot hope to do justice to this important question, the implications of quantum physics for understanding the relationship between science and ethics, on the basis of mere analogies. That's one important lesson we should understand from the plethora of failed attempts. Freyne's Copenhagen is a case in point. In this sense, the play can be used as an important teaching tool. In what follows, I examine the play in some detail to draw some important contrasts and to help set the stage for introducing some of the main themes of this book. This interlude provides a dramatic introduction to some of the relevant historical background, main characters, and key ideas, and enables me to highlight some of the important ways in which my approach differs from the more common analogical approaches. Does one as a physicist have the moral right to work on the practical exploitation of atomic energy? Heisenberg's haunting question to Bohr hangs in the air throughout Copenhagen. But for its playwright, Michael Frayn, this moral question is a side issue. The one that really interests him is the meta-ethical question of how it is possible to make moral judgments at all. Frayn puts it this way: the moral issues always finally depend on the epistemological one, on the judgment of other people's motives, because if you can't have any knowledge of other people's motive, it is very difficult to come to any objective moral judgment on their behavior. But how does this dilemma arise? Why can't we have any knowledge of other people's motives and intentions? According to Frayn, the root of the dilemma derives from the analogy he wants to draw with Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. The Heisenberg's uncertainty principle says that there is a necessary limit to what we can simultaneously know about certain pairs of physical quantities, such as the position and momentum of a particle. The momentum of a particle is related to its velocity. In particular, momentum in mass is mass times velocity. Frayn suggests that, by way of analogy, there is a necessary limit to what we can know about mental states, such as thoughts, intentions, and motivations, including our own. But if the goal is to set up an uncertainty principle for people in analogy with the famous one that Heisenberg proposes for particles, and one is committed to doing so with some care, then it does not follow that we can't have any knowledge of other people's motives. Let's look more closely at what Heisenberg's principle says. Heisenberg does not say that we can't have any knowledge about a particle's position and momentum. Rather, he specifies a trade-off between how well we can know both quantities at once. The more we know about a particle's position, the less we know about its momentum, and vice versa. So, if, as Frayn suggests, he is interested in constructing an analogous principle for people that specifies a trade-off between a subject's action and the subject's motivations behind those actions, it would have to say something more along the lines of, we can't have full knowledge of people's motives and know something about their actions that enacts those motives. That is, we can't be fully certain about a person's action and what motivates those actions, which is not to say that I endorse such a principle. I am simply trying to tidy up the analogy Frayn wants to make. But the fact that knowledge of motivations is not prohibited, but rather limited, has enormously important consequences for thinking about the question of moral judgment. Frayn argues that since there is no way, in principle, to get around the limits of our knowledge, and we are therefore forever blocked from having any knowledge about someone's motives, it is not possible to make any objective moral judgments. However, as we just saw, a more careful way of drawing the analogy does not in fact undermine any and all considerations of moral issues based on knowledge of the motivation behind the subject's action, as long as those considerations do not require full and complete knowledge, but can instead be based on partial understandings. Now, Frayn is the first to admit that the analogy that he draws is not an exact parallel. But his admission has nothing to do with the crucial fault in his analogical reasoning that we just discussed. Rather, Frayn's concession is of a different sort. He readily acknowledges that he is not making an argument for the limits of moral judgments on the basis of quantum physics, but he does see his play as a means of exploring a parallel epistemic limit for discerning the content of mental states, like thoughts, motives, and intentions. Hence, his overstatement of the principled limitation poses a fundamental difficulty that goes to the core issue at play. But rather than stop here, it is instructive to continue our consideration of Frayn's analogical methodology. Before we examine how Frayn exploits his parallel in the play, it's important to understand what is at stake in the way he frames the issue. Another specter haunts the play: questions of the playwright's motivations. The stakes are these. The controversy about the matter of Heisenberg's intentions in visiting Bohr in Nazi-occupied Copenhagen in 1941 has never been settled. Indeed, the question about why Heisenberg went to visit Bohr during the war is a pivotal clue in a much larger puzzle that history yearns to resolve. What role did Heisenberg play as a leading German scientist and head of the Nazi bomb project during World War II? Did Heisenberg, as he claimed after the war, do his best to foil the German bomb project? Or was the actual stumbling block that undermined the German project the fact that Heisenberg had failed to get the physics right? A conclusion drawn by the majority of the physics community. Freyne is clearly sympathetic to Heisenberg's post-war rendering, and Freyne also doesn't hide the fact that his uncertainty principle for psychological states of mind is a means of attempting to get history to back off from issuing any harsh judgment against Heisenberg. I find it very difficult to judge people who lived in totalitarian society, Freyne says. You can admire people who acted heroically, but you can't expect people to behave that way. It's important to note that the play itself generated a considerable amount of controversy, especially following its opening in the United States. Its enthusiastic reception in London notwithstanding, American scientists and historians of science have criticized the play for its gross historical inaccuracies and its far too sympathetic portrayal of Heisenberg. Freyne acknowledges that Thomas Power's Pulitzer Prize-winning book Heisenberg's War, The Secret History of German Bomb, 1993, was the inspiration for his play. Inspiration is one thing, but when a discredited account forms the primary basis for drawing the outlines and details of a dramatization of an important historical encounter, does the artist not have some obligation to history? What are the moral obligations and responsibilities of the artist? Questions of this nature have been asked of Freyne. But even when the emergence of new historical evidence that flies in the face of Freyne's reconstruction, he remains resolutely unrepentant. In his responses to his critics, he insists that he doesn't feel any obligation to hold himself responsible to the historical facts. Perhaps we shouldn't be surprised, since he claims to have offered a principled argument to absolve Heisenberg from any responsibility to his history. Perhaps Heisenberg does indeed deserve absolution, but Freyne's argument is that we have no ground to make such a determination. Significantly, the journalist Thomas Power's rendition is based on the discredited thesis of the Swiss-German journalist Robert Jungk. Initially published in German, Jungk's reconstruction of the historical events Brighter Than a Thousand Suns, German edition 1956, English edition 1958, exculpates the German scientists for their involvement in the war effort, Heisenberg foremost among them, and argues that they were secretly engaged in resistance efforts against Hitler. In Power's book, we find this myth of heroic resistance expanded into a highly embellished shadow history of the German atomic bomb project. Significantly, Robert Jungk has publicly repudiated his own thesis. For his part, Jungk admits to having been far too impressed with the personalities involved. Jungk takes his inspiration from a letter Heisenberg sent to him after the war, detailing his recollection of the famous 1941 meeting with Bohr. Jungk includes a copy of the letter in his book. He notes that if one could interpret the contents of the conversation between Bohr and Heisenberg in psychological terms, it would depend on very fine nuances indeed. Freyne was clearly impressed by the possibility of considering the very fine nuances in psychological terms. But Bohr was not. Bohr was engaged by Heisenberg's recasting of the story. Upon encountering the letter in Jungk's book, Bohr drafted a letter to Heisenberg denouncing his misleading account. But Bohr never sent the letter. Following his death in 1962, the Bohr family discovered several drafts of the letter and deposited them with the Niels Bohr archive in Copenhagen with instruction to have them sealed until 2012, 50 years after Bohr's death. Historians could only speculate about Bohr's version of the encounter, but then in 2002, the Bohr family agreed to the early release of all documents pertaining to the 1941 visit, including different versions of Bohr's unsent letter to Heisenberg. The early release was precipitated by public interest in the controversy generated by Franz Copenhagen. What do the documents reveal? In his response to Heisenberg, Bohr makes it clear that he was shocked and dismayed by the news Heisenberg brought to Copenhagen in 1941, that Germany was participating vigorously in a race to be the first atomic weapons. Bohr writes to Heisenberg, "You expressed your definite conviction that Germany would win, and that it was therefore quite foolish for us to maintain the hope of a different outcome of the war, and to be reticent as regards all German offers of cooperation. I also remember quite clearly our conversation in my room at the Institute, where in vague terms you spoke in a manner that could only give me the firm impression that, under your leadership, everything was being done in Germany to develop atomic weapons, and that you said that there was no need to talk about details, since you were completely familiar with them and had spent the past 2 years working more or less exclusively on such preparations. I listened to this without speaking, since a great matter for mankind was at issue in which, despite our personal friendship, we had to be regarded as representatives of two sides in a mortal combat." Niels Bohr Archive. And in the draft written in 1962, the year of Bohr's death, Bohr tells Heisenberg, "It is quite incomprehensible to me that you should think that you hinted to me that the German physicists would do all they could to prevent such an application of atomic science." In direct contradiction to the story Heisenberg tells to Jung, which is later embellished by Powers. How does Freyne react to this revelation? He remains steadfast in the face of this crucial addition to the historical record. Freyne has indicated that the release of these important historical documents has had little effect on his thinking about the relevant issues and would not affect any future editions of the play. He admits only one inaccuracy, for that he portrays Bohr as having forgiven Heisenberg too readily. This dismissive stance toward history is completely consistent with Freyne's privileging of psychological, internal states over historical, external facts throughout the play. A point, as we will see, that reaches a crescendo in the play's final scene. For Freyne, no historical fact can trump psychological uncertainty. We are not accountable to history in principle.